The first thing Daniel Carter noticed after losing his job was the silence. For 11 years, he had worked at Harrington Global, a massive company with glass walls, polished floors, and executives who spoke about millions of dollars as if they were talking about pocket change. Daniel had never been rich, but he had always been proud of one thing. He had never allowed his 8-year-old son, Noah, to go to bed hungry. Every morning, Daniel woke before sunrise, packed Noah's lunch, prepared a simple breakfast, and drove him to school before heading to work. He was a single father, and life was not easy, but he had learned how to survive by doing everything himself. He worked hard, kept his head down, and never complained. Then, one Tuesday morning, everything changed. Daniel was called into the office of the company's CEO, Richard Harrington. Richard was a powerful man in his late 50s, known for his expensive suits, sharp decisions, and cold expression. He had built Harrington Global into a billion-dollar company, and everyone in the building was afraid of him. Daniel entered the office expecting to discuss a project he had been working on for months. Instead, Richard didn't even ask him to sit down. "We're eliminating your position," he said. Daniel stared at him, unable to process the words. "My position?" he asked quietly. Richard looked at a folder on his desk. "The company is restructuring. Your department is being reduced." Daniel swallowed hard. "Mr. Harrington, I understand the company has to make changes, but I have a son. I've been here for 11 years. I've never missed a deadline, never caused a problem, and I've always—" "This is not personal," Richard interrupted. Daniel looked at him. "It feels personal when the person making the decision is sitting 3 feet away from me." For the first time, Richard looked up. His expression remained cold. "You'll receive your final payment according to company policy." And just like that, Daniel was fired. No warning, no conversation, no second chance. He walked out of the building carrying a small cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a family photograph, and a cheap desk plant Noah had given him for Father's Day. He had no idea that the worst part of losing his job would not be the empty bank account, the overdue bills, or the fear of telling his son. The worst part would be realizing that the man who had fired him had no idea what kind of person he had just pushed out of his life. For the next few weeks, Daniel searched for work everywhere. He applied to dozens of companies, attended interviews, and accepted temporary jobs that paid barely enough to keep the lights on. He started delivering groceries during the day and driving for a delivery service at night. Sometimes he came home so tired that he fell asleep sitting at the kitchen table. But he never let Noah see how scared he was. Every night, he smiled and said, "We're going to be okay." Noah believed him because children often believe their parents even when the world is falling apart. But Daniel's life was about to change because of someone he had never expected to become important. Her name was Evelyn Moore. She lived in the small, pale blue house next door. She was 78 years old, lived alone, and had a garden filled with roses that she could no longer properly care for. Daniel had seen her many times before, but they had never really spoken beyond a polite greeting. One afternoon, while Daniel was carrying groceries from his car, he noticed Evelyn struggling to lift a heavy bag from her porch. He immediately walked over. "Let me help you with that," he said. Evelyn looked surprised. "Oh, I can manage." Daniel smiled. "I believe you, but you don't have to." He carried the bag inside for her. The next day, he noticed a broken light bulb above her front door. He replaced it. A few days later, he saw her trying to drag a heavy trash bin toward the street. He took it for her. Then he noticed the weeds growing in her garden and spent an hour clearing them. Evelyn kept asking him why he was doing so much. Daniel always gave the same answer: "Because I'm here." At first, Evelyn tried to pay him. Daniel refused. Then she tried to give him homemade cookies. Daniel accepted those. Soon a routine formed. Every morning, Daniel checked on Evelyn before taking Noah to school. He brought her groceries, fixed small things around the house, carried packages, cleaned leaves from her walkway, and sat with her for a few minutes whenever she seemed lonely. Sometimes Noah came with him. The boy would sit beside Evelyn and listen to her stories about the life she had lived. Evelyn had once been a teacher. She had taught hundreds of children, including some who later became doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business leaders. She had never married, never had children, and spent most of her life believing that the students she had helped were her family. But there was one student she had never forgotten. His name was Richard Harrington. Years earlier, Richard had been a quiet, poor boy in Evelyn's classroom. He had worn the same jacket almost every day. He often came to school without lunch. Other children made fun of him, but Evelyn had always protected him. She gave him books, encouraged him to apply for scholarships, and told him that his difficult childhood did not have to determine his future. Richard had eventually become one of the most successful businessmen in the country, but Evelyn had not seen him in almost 20 years. She had no idea that the man who had fired Daniel was the same boy she had once helped. Daniel knew nothing about this connection. He only knew that Evelyn was kind, lonely, and needed someone. As the months passed, Daniel's financial situation became worse. His savings disappeared. The landlord gave him a warning. His car began making strange noises. One evening, Daniel sat at the kitchen table, staring at a stack of bills, while Noah quietly did his homework nearby. Daniel rubbed his face with both hands. "Dad?" Noah asked. Daniel quickly looked up. "Yeah? Are we gonna have to move?" Daniel froze. Children notice more than adults think. Daniel forced a smile. "Why would you ask that?" Noah looked at the unpaid bills. "Because you keep looking at them." Daniel slowly reached across the table and held his son's hand. "Listen to me. Things are difficult right now, but we are together. That means we are going to be okay." Noah nodded, but Daniel could see the worry in his eyes. The next morning, Daniel received a phone call from a company he had applied to months earlier. They told him they had chosen another candidate. It was the 7th rejection that month. Daniel sat in his car afterward, gripping the steering wheel, trying not to cry. He had always believed that hard work eventually paid off, but that morning, for the first time, he wondered if hard work was enough. Then he saw Evelyn standing in her front yard. She was holding a small envelope. "Daniel?" she called. He got out of the car. "Everything okay?" Evelyn asked. Daniel smiled. "Just a bad morning." She studied his face. "You've had many bad mornings lately." Daniel looked away. Evelyn walked closer. "You help everyone, Daniel, but you never let anyone help you." Daniel gave a quiet laugh. "I'm just trying to take care of my son." "And who takes care of you?" she asked. Daniel had no answer. Evelyn handed him the envelope. "I want you to take this." Daniel immediately shook his head. "No, Evelyn, I can't. You don't even know what it is." "It doesn't matter. You always say that." She smiled gently. "Open it." Inside was a letter. Evelyn had written a recommendation for him. She had contacted one of her former students, a successful business owner, and asked him to meet Daniel. "You know someone who can help me find a job?" Daniel asked. "I know many people," Evelyn replied. "I just never needed to ask them for anything before." Daniel accepted the letter, unaware that Evelyn's life was connected to the man who had destroyed his career. 2 days later, Daniel attended an interview at a respected company. The owner was impressed by his experience and offered him a position. It wasn't as high-paying as his old job, but it was stable. Daniel was overwhelmed with relief. He came home and hugged Noah so tightly that the boy laughed. Then he went next door to tell Evelyn. She smiled when she heard the news. "I knew someone would see your value." Daniel shook his head. "You did this?" Evelyn looked at him. "No, you did. I only opened a door." But life had one more door to open. A few weeks later, Richard Harrington received an unexpected phone call. It was from an old number he had not seen in decades. The voice on the other end was weak but familiar. "Richard?" He froze. "Who is this?" There was a pause. "It's Evelyn Moore." Richard stood up so quickly that his chair rolled backward. For a moment, the powerful CEO of Harrington Global was no longer a billionaire businessman. He was a frightened teenage boy sitting in a classroom, holding a book that his teacher had given him when nobody else believed in him. "Mrs. Moore," he whispered, "I thought you were gone." "Not yet," Evelyn said with a soft laugh. Richard immediately drove to her house. He arrived in an expensive car and stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored suit. But when he saw Evelyn standing at the door, something changed in his face. He walked toward her slowly. "You look exactly the same," he said. Evelyn smiled. "You look very different." Richard laughed nervously. "I suppose I do." They talked for nearly an hour. Evelyn told him about her life, her garden, her quiet house, and the people she had met. Then she mentioned Daniel. "Daniel Carter?" Richard asked suddenly. Evelyn looked at him.
"You know him?" Richard's expression changed. "I fired him." The room became silent. Evelyn stared at him. "You fired the man who has been helping me every single day?" Richard looked down. "I didn't know." "You didn't know his name, did you?" Richard remained silent. Evelyn's voice became gentle but firm. "You didn't know he was a single father. You didn't know he was working nights to pay his bills. You didn't know that while you were deciding his future in less than 5 minutes, he was going home to a child who depended on him." Richard looked toward the window. "The company had to make cuts." "Perhaps," Evelyn replied. "But you made the decision without ever looking at the person in front of you." Richard had no response. Then Evelyn said something that hit him harder than any business loss ever had. "Daniel never once asked me who you were. He never helped me because he wanted something. He didn't know I was the person who helped you become the man you are today. He simply saw an elderly woman who needed help." Richard lowered his head. For the first time in many years, the CEO of Harrington Global felt ashamed. Not because he had lost money. Not because someone had criticized him. He was ashamed because a man he had dismissed as an employee had shown more humanity than he had shown in years. The next morning, Richard drove to Daniel's house. He stood outside the door for several seconds before knocking. Daniel opened it. The moment he saw Richard, his expression hardened. "What are you doing here?" Richard took a breath. "I came to apologize." Daniel stared at him. "For firing me?" "Yes. You didn't apologize when you fired me." "I know." "You didn't ask if I was okay." "I know." "You didn't ask if I had a family." Richard nodded slowly. "I know." Daniel looked behind him, where Noah was sitting at the kitchen table. Richard noticed the boy's school books, the small apartment, and the simple life Daniel had been trying to protect. "I made a mistake," Richard said. Daniel's voice was quiet. "You made a decision." "Both can be true." Daniel said nothing. Richard continued. "I met someone recently who reminded me of the kind of man I used to want to be." Daniel looked confused. "Who?" Richard looked toward Evelyn's house. "Your neighbor." Daniel's eyes widened. "You know Evelyn?" Richard nodded. "She was my teacher." Daniel slowly realized there was a story he had never heard. Richard told him everything. He told him about being a poor teenager, about the teacher who had believed in him, about the scholarship she helped him receive, and about how he had eventually lost contact with her. Then he said, "I spent years building a company. I became obsessed with success. Somewhere along the way, I forgot the people who helped me get there." Daniel remained silent. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "I'm not here to buy your forgiveness." Daniel looked at the envelope, but did not take it. "Then what is it?" "A job offer." Daniel gave a bitter smile. "I already have a job." "I know. I heard." Daniel looked surprised. Richard continued, "I'm not asking you to come back as the same employee. I want you to lead a new department focused on employee development and fair transition programs. People who lose their jobs should not be treated like numbers. You understand that better than anyone." Daniel looked at him carefully. "Why me?" Richard answered without hesitation. "Because I fired you before I knew you. And after watching what you did for Evelyn, I realized the company needs people who understand that every person has a life beyond the office." Daniel did not immediately accept the offer. He told Richard he needed time. Richard nodded. "Take all the time you need." Then he turned to leave. But before he reached the sidewalk, Daniel called out, "Richard." The CEO stopped. "Evelyn needs help with her roof. It's leaking." Richard turned around. Daniel continued, "If you really want to make things right, start there." Richard looked at the small blue house next door. Then he smiled for the first time in a long time. I can do that. The following Saturday, something unusual happened. The CEO of a billion-dollar company stood on Evelyn's front porch wearing old work clothes, holding a toolbox. Daniel was there too. Noah was helping carry small items from the garage. Evelyn sat in a chair nearby, laughing as she watched the two men work. Richard repaired the roof. Daniel fixed the garden fence. Noah painted a wooden flower box. And for the first time in decades, Richard and Evelyn talked like teacher and student again. At one point, Richard looked at Daniel and said, "You know, I thought I was successful because I had built a billion-dollar company." Daniel smiled. "What changed your mind?" Richard looked at Evelyn, then at Noah, then at the man he had once fired. "I realized success is not what you can buy. It's who would still open the door when you have nothing left to offer." Daniel eventually accepted Richard's offer, but he made one condition. Every employee being laid off would receive proper support, career assistance, and a personal meeting with someone who would actually listen to them. Richard agreed. And over time, the program changed the company. But the biggest change happened inside Richard himself. He began visiting Evelyn every Sunday. Sometimes he brought groceries. Sometimes he repaired something. Sometimes he simply sat with her and listened to stories from the past. One afternoon, Evelyn looked at him and said, "You know, Richard, you were always a good boy." Richard smiled. "I'm not sure the CEO of Harrington Global would agree." Evelyn laughed. "That's because the CEO got lost." Richard looked down. "And did I find him again?" Evelyn reached over and placed her hand on his. "No," she said. "You found someone better." Years later, Daniel would often tell people that losing his job had been one of the most painful experiences of his life. But it had also led him to Evelyn. And Evelyn had reminded him that kindness is never wasted, even when nobody is watching. Richard would tell a different version of the story. He would say that the day he fired Daniel, he believed he was removing a problem from his company. He later realized that Daniel had been the person who could teach him what his success had failed to teach him. Because sometimes, the person you dismiss is the person who reveals the truth about who you have become. Sometimes, the door you open expecting to see a stranger is the door that leads you back to the people and values you forgot. And sometimes, the greatest reward for helping someone every day is not money, a promotion, or recognition. Sometimes, it is simply discovering that your kindness changed the life of someone who had the power to change yours. Daniel never helped Evelyn because he knew she had once changed the life of a future CEO. He helped her because she was an elderly woman who needed someone. Richard never expected the man he fired to become the person who would help him find his humanity again. And Evelyn never expected the quiet boy she once taught to return to her doorstep as a billionaire. But life has a strange way of bringing people back to the moments that matter most. So if you ever wonder whether a small act of kindness is worth it, remember Daniel Carter. He carried groceries. He fixed a light. He pulled a trash bin to the street. He spent a few minutes listening to an elderly woman who was lonely. He thought he was simply helping his neighbor. He never knew that every small act was quietly building a bridge between three lives. And when the CEO who fired him finally opened the door, he discovered that the man he had once dismissed had become the very person who could teach him what true success really meant.